Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing great and having a wonderful day. I am bringing another exciting topic as your broker in charge, and this one is going to be the difference between notices of termination or termination versus a release of contract. So, what's typically happening right now is a buyer or a seller, mainly a buyer, will want to terminate a contract, and whether or not there's a dispute on earnest money really is irrelevant on the termination side of things. However, there seems to be a lot of confusion, or there is a lot of confusion because of the paperwork and how it's processed, of what a notice of termination is versus a release of agreement. So I just want to go through those really quickly on this, as it's important to delineate the two. So let's start with the notice of termination. The notice of termination is the form that you would use if you are basically a buyer in a tradition. The most common example would be a buyer during due diligence cannot come to an agreement with the seller on the repairs or any sort of inspection, so they're terminating. You would then send this document here. This document is a notice of termination. It is not any sort of authorization to disperse the earnest money. That's super important. This is a unilateral communication. So there's a lot of, and what I mean by that is this is a communication that can come directly from the buyer to the seller and saying, based on the terms of the contract, I am terminating this agreement. And if it's part of due diligence, this agreement obviously would have to accompany the termination fee. So once you send this termination in, you're going to deliver it, and then you're going to select one of the reasons. There are a handful of reasons here. Again, the most common one is going to be that the buyer is terminated during due diligence with the fee accompanying this notice, which means you would deliver this notice as well as the fee to the either physical address or the digital address that was given in the contract in Form 310. Basically, once this is sent, then at that point you have a terminated contract, assuming it was terminated under the terms of the contract. So let's just say again, for example purposes, this is a traditional situation where the buyer is terminating under due diligence, they're sending that over, and you're good to go. You still have to have a release of agreement, because the release of agreement also releases the earnest money. You would also want a lease of agreement if there is any sort of dispute, right? If let's say you terminate and the buyer is terminates late, or the seller tries to terminate, or the buyer terminates outside of due diligence, you can still send the termination notice, which again at that point is simply a notice, but you do not have a release of contract. When you get a release of contract is when you will then use the next form, which is the release of contract form. This is form 518. And this is the form that you will see. This is a release of agreement for contract to buy and sell real estate. This is also where you will release the earnest money using one of these four options down here. It's super important to understand that if they release this, we're not attorneys, but if they release this, the contract at that point has been released. So if you have a termination that was sent, but you still have a dispute on the earnest money, or let's say the earnest money is going to go a different route, you would address that here. The most common thing that we're seeing anytime that you have any sort of dispute are going to come up in options 3 or options 4. Option 3 says we are going to release the contract and we are going to give X amount of the earnest money to the buyer and X amount of the earnest money to the seller. Or option 4, basically at this point, option 4 says all parties agree to terminate the contract, but they're still going to dispute the release of the earnest money. And then at that point, it then goes to the hands of the attorneys to figure out, or not figure out, but the attorney who's holding the earnest money, or if it's not the attorney, if a real estate company at that point, they would then have to take the proper channels to have both buyer and seller come to some sort of agreement or take legal action at that point. So just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to give me a call. Have a great day. Take care.